Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the third of three virtual events that we're hosting to talk about mail voting in Pennsylvania, setting the record straight. There's been confusion, mis and disinformation. We just want to get good information out there to help people understand how the system works. And these events, they're being sponsored by a coalition of good government groups. We've got All Voting is Local. We've got the Committee of 70, and we've got Pitt Cyber at the University of Pittsburgh. If you missed any of the previous two events, you can find them on YouTube, you can find them on Facebook, you can find them all over the internet. That's the coolest thing out there. So please make sure to check those out. I'm Jonathan Lai. I'm the data and democracy reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'll be moderating today's conversation, and I cover voting rights and election administration here in Pennsylvania for the past several years. And I got some really cool people in front of me today. Really excited about this conversation we have here. I'll let them introduce themselves. Jeff, why don't we start with you?
Good evening, all. Thanks for checking us out tonight. My name is Jeff Greenberg. I am the senior advisor to the Voter Project here in Pennsylvania, and I was a former Mercer County election director. I served from 2007 until 2020.
And Jeff is one of the most respected county elections officials that we've had in a while in Pennsylvania. So he really knows his stuff cold. Liz, you've been behind the scenes doing a lot of work in Pennsylvania and audits and all of that. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Jonathan. So great to be here tonight. And thank you so much for the important work that all the groups are doing to provide accurate information to the public, which is absolutely critical in this cycle and as we look ahead. So my name is Liz Howard. I'm senior counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, and I'm the former deputy commissioner of elections in Virginia.
And Jonathan Marks, you're the one that every county elections official in Pennsylvania calls when things are going poorly, when things are going well. You're just the one that they call at all hours of the night. Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for having me. My name is Jonathan Marks. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Elections and Commissions at the Department of State. And I will reiterate what you said, Jonathan. Jeff Greenberg is definitely one of the most respected election officials who ever served in that position or in that capacity in the Commonwealth. And it's great to see Liz again. Thank you for all the work you do. And as she said, thanks to all the groups out there who are doing their part to make sure folks have accurate information. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Thank you again.
So in the last two conversations, we've talked through the process of requesting a mail ballot, whether it's an absentee or a mail-in ballot here in Pennsylvania. We've talked about how you fill out that ballot, how you return it. We've talked about the process of looking over the envelopes, getting those ballots opened and flattened and scanned, and the results coming in. And tonight's conversation is really going to be about what happens after that initial vote count. We're going to talk about audits, including what we actually mean when we talk about audits. We're going to talk about certification and getting those final results in. And we're going to talk about sort of the security of that process, the importance of that process, and some of the things that are changing. But before we get there, Jonathan, there's been some big news in the last day around undated mail ballots, wrongly dated mail ballots in Pennsylvania. So I just want to give you a chance to sort of tell us, what is the message for voters from the Pennsylvania Department of State?
The message for voters is very simple. To ensure that your ballot is counted, you need to make sure you sign the outer envelope on your ballot. You date the ballot with today's date, the current date, and that you return it to your county board of elections by 8 p.m. Given that we're about a week out from the election, we're urging voters at this point to return their ballot by hand or in person if they can to their county board of elections or to a secure drop box in their county. And folks can go to our website at vote.pa.gov to find a list of county drop boxes, or they can go to their own county's website.
And just for clarification, Jonathan, that's 8 p.m. on election day that those ballots
are correct.
Back.
8 p.m. on election day must be received by the county. So postmarked doesn't count, so it has to be received by the county by 8 p.m.
And we want to remind voters as well to make sure that they insert their ballot into the secrecy envelope as well. As we say, no naked ballots.
All right. So
Thank you, Jeff.
once we get to that point where all the ballots are in, we talked about the votes starting, counties starting to count those ballots at 7 a.m. Again, if you want any of that information, please check out the previous two videos. So we get to the point where the ballots have gone through the tabulation process, right? People see the results. They can go on electionreturns.pa.gov and see them. We can see those results. They've been counted. Now we get to the point where we're talking about audits. Liz, you are the audit expert. What is a post-election audit?
So from an election security standpoint, there are two critical components of a solid election security system. So that is going to include paper ballots and a post-election audit, where you go back and you review those paper ballots to make sure that the results that have come out are accurate. So in Pennsylvania, we're talking about, in particular, tabulation audits. So, in a couple of different contexts, we're going back to check the paper record to make sure that the machines are working correctly, and for statewide elections to make sure that the election outcome is accurate. Did the winner really win? Did the loser really lose?
Got it. So, the word audit has gone and thrown around in many different contexts when it comes to elections. So just to be clear on what we are talking about today, we're talking about double checking whether the results that have been reported as being counted and cast, whether that's accurate.
Yeah, so in Pennsylvania right now, there are two different types of post-election tabulation audits that are being conducted. The statutory audit is conducted on a county-by-county basis and requires every county to review at least 2% or 2,000, whichever is fewer ballots. And they will go back and count those ballots by hand and compare them to the totals printed by the individual voting machines. So that's an important check, and that does ensure that those individual voting machines are working correctly. But of course, it's just you're just selecting a few machines, and you're not able, using that traditional audit method, to look at statewide results from a statewide election and confirm that those are accurate. So in order to do that, the state recently required counties to conduct a risk limiting audit, which is slightly different from a traditional audit, but it's an efficient and effective auditing method. So by efficient, I mean that the election officials only have to look at the number of ballots necessary to provide a predetermined confidence level of the accuracy of the outcome. And this number of ballots is going to change based on the margin of victory. So when you have a large margin of victory, then the number of ballots that you have to review is smaller, compared to when your margin of victory is very small, then the number of ballots that you have to review is large. So for instance, in 2020, Georgia conducted a risk limiting audit of the presidential campaign after the general election. The margin was very small, so the risk limiting audit resulted in a statewide hand count of all the ballots cast in that state. And then also, right, it's effective. Again, this is the type of audit that's going to provide confirmation of the accuracy of the outcome, not necessarily about individual machines. But again, did the winner really win, and did the loser really lose?
Got it. So you talked about these two different types of audits. There's one that is in statute and Pennsylvania has done for a long time. And then there's one that we're sort of starting to pivot toward doing now, and that's sort of been rolled out over the last few years. So I want to start with that first one. Let's talk about the one that has been around for a long time. Jeff, when we talk about these voting machines and the 2% or the 2,000 ballot audit that's in statute, can you tell us what that is? Like, what were you actually doing when you were doing that?
Sure. And normally a county like ours, we would be identifying randomly precincts where ballots totaled up to that 2% threshold. So we would want to do that randomly, whether it was to put names in a hat and pull out precincts randomly. And once we got to that threshold of whatever that 2% level was in a county our size in Mercer, where we only had about 70,000 voters, and even in a busy year, we might have 55,000 votes cast or ballots cast. So once we got to that threshold of a little over 1,000 ballots, and we would start doing that audit. I think one of the shortcomings that Liz kind of touched upon, when you think about the differences between what Pennsylvania has done for a long time And what the risk limiting audit will allow us to do is imagine a county with 100,000 voters or 100,000 ballots cast, and they would be doing, under the current law, 2,000 ballots, which is the max, 2%, compared to a county that might have 500,000 ballots cast, or a million, let's say, in a really busy year. And that max would be the same, 2,000 ballots. So clearly there is a problem when you're comparing the percentage of ballots in counties depending on the size. So my hope is obviously that Pennsylvania moves the risk limiting audit to statutory requirement in the near future and eliminate the 2% altogether. I think Pennsylvania voters would be much better served with that process.
So we used to have this 2% audit or the 2,000 ballot audit, depending on the county, depending on the election. You're describing that sort of like outdated. It doesn't necessarily keep up with the best practices. And that's what we're going to start talking about, these risk limiting audits, these RLAs. In order to get there, there are a couple of steps. So Jonathan, this one's for you. Can you explain to us the voting machine upgrade and replacement and what that meant, how that created this?
Sure. And this ties into what Liz said earlier when she's talking about the, basic components that you need to do a successful risk limiting audit. The first thing is you need to have paper records of the votes cast, paper ballots. So prior to 2018, all but 14 counties in the Commonwealth were using direct recording electronic voting systems, meaning touchscreen voting systems. There was no paper record of the votes cast. So the official record of the votes were stored on the voting system. So there was really nothing to audit in terms of a voter verifiable record. So the first thing we had to do was upgrade all of our voting systems so that every voting system used in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had a voter verifiable paper record, meaning that the voter was able to see it, confirm their, able to confirm their choices on the ballot. And that record then would be available for post-election auditing, as well as any recounts that may occur. So that was the big important first step. Obviously, then we had to, undertake figuring out what is the best model. There are a variety of different types of post-election audits, and even a handful of different types of risk limiting audits. So we convened a work group of county election officials and also experts on post-election auditing. And that work group over 3 years did a number of pilots. We did several statewide pilots of risk limiting audits. And we actually, coincidentally, Jeff Greenberg, Mercer County, when he was election director in Mercer County, conducted the first risk limiting audit pilot in Pennsylvania. Philly was soon after that, and that was back in 2019. Then we had several statewide pilots after that. And I'll give Lancaster County credit for doing the first. We called it a sandbox. It wasn't really a pilot, but we did go to Lancaster County, and all of that, all of the efforts of that work group were critically important. We, a lot of lessons learned. Counties certainly learned what they needed to know about organizing their ballots, organizing their equipment prior to election day, so that they were in a good position to do these post-election audits. And certainly, we learned a lot about what different counties do and their different practices, and that enabled us to ultimately arrive at a recommendation from the work group how counties will do post-election audits moving forward. And beginning in November, we'll do our first, I'll call it live risk limiting audit, not a pilot, and it's going to occur before the results are certified. So,
Jeff, I'm going to want to hear about your pilot in a sec. But first, Liz, can you help us understand what this risk limiting audit actually is?
So it's a statistical auditing method that's going to provide, again, confirmation that the outcome is not inaccurate, right? So it provides confirmation, again, that we have accurate, like that the outcome is accurate, that the winner really won and the loser really lost. So depending, as Jonathan mentioned, there are different types, right? So one could consider that there are different types, there are different flavors of risk limiting audits. So we tried multiple different types, multiple different flavors of risk limiting audits, and the pilot and the sandbox process were absolutely critical, I think, in the work group working with the Department of State staff on making the recommendations about the specific type of risk limiting audit that needs to be that is best suited for Pennsylvania. And really, Pennsylvania is taking, this is just a really important step for Pennsylvania to take for election security. They're leading the rest of the country. Pennsylvania will be the 5th state to require these post-election audits, these risk limiting audits in particular, which again are considered the gold standard of post-election tabulation audits by experts. So they're going to join Colorado, Georgia, Rhode Island, and Virginia. And I know that there have been election officials from other states that have been curious about risk limiting audits, and they have come to observe the pilots that have been conducted in Pennsylvania. The election officials have really been helpful to each other in the state, which has been so great to see, and their colleagues from across the country that are interested in this procedure as well.
All right, so we have a risk limiting audit. It's going to be a statistical thing. Jeff, you were the first county to run the pilot. What was that actually like? What were you actually doing?
So let me take you back a little further first. When Jonathan first broached the topic of risk limiting audits at one of our statewide conferences, and I don't remember exactly what year it was now, but it had to be maybe 17 or 18, maybe. And I was one of the first people that stood up and said, "What?" And I can't understand this, and I don't know how I'm going to explain this to voters, and I don't understand how I could count 100 ballots instead of 2,000 and have a higher confidence level. And in the end, it was literally being convinced by doing that the statistical methods, the mathematics behind this process are what makes it solid. And it was a scary proposition to start. So it felt like it was really foreign to try to figure out how to do this. But once we really got our hands on it, it was as simple as could be. I can remember reassuring many elections directors that second year that, look, I know it feels hard, but literally once you do it, you will realize there's nothing hard about it. It's really a simple process that really falls back on the statistics and mathematics to allow it to happen. So in our case, we really had one major hurdle. So we did have a lot of people, as it was suggested, that came in from all over, which was a little intimidating. And I have to say that my friend Jessica Mathis, your coworker Jonathan, she gave me that first call, and it was, "I have an offer you can't refuse, Jeff." And she was just too good of a friend for me to say no. So little did I know what I was getting myself into. But we really wanted, our warehouse situation was not ideal to host that, and knowing some of the folks that were coming in. So we made room in our commissioner's meeting room in the courthouse, which isn't very large either. And so logistically, it was probably about as bad a way that you would want to conduct a risk limiting audit, because we had to transport absent or ballots back and forth in groups of 10 precincts from the warehouse to the courthouse. And that really made things difficult, but we got through it and it was a success. It was a long day. And one of the big lessons learned quickly in that case was you've got to be able to do these where your ballots are located. So I went to Lawrence County. After that, I went to Erie County and a couple of the other pilots, and they were doing their risk limiting audits in the same room that their ballots were stored. And literally it was identifying, they have these cool looking 20, or what is it, 20-sided die or 10-sided die? 10-sided, right? But they come up with a 20-digit number, and that number is literally put into a computer, and that computer tells you these are the batches that you're going to pull. And so it's pretty slick. And once that's done, you really just start pulling your batches and hand counting them to assure that those results match. what the machines did.
As you said, you're hand counting them, right? Because what we talked about previously, like in the initial count, we're running these through high-speed scanners or tabulation machines at the precincts, but that's not what you're doing this time. You're actually hand counting.
And look, that's to me is so important to emphasize, because I've already seen some stories. We've seen this not just in Pennsylvania but elsewhere, pushing for hand counts. And hand counts by, that's what the risk limiting audit is. It literally is a hand count. So counties that are saying, well, we're going to do the 2%, we're going to do the risk limiting audit, and then we're going to do our own hand count of random precincts, they're literally doing the same work again that they're already doing. And it should give people confidence, those people who don't have maybe 100% confidence in our voting systems, which is sad, but we know it's there, that there is an actual human that's looking at ballots to assure that those results were accurately counted.
And so I'm thinking about that sort of that random selection, and how, as you were saying, you're like, how can 100 be better than 2000? But as you said, there's a lot of math behind it. Liz, let's not get into all the math of it. But as you were saying, the margins really matter here, and you were giving the example of Georgia. So can you just say a little bit more about what, sort of the dynamics of this? As the margins get closer, what happens? Because as we know in Pennsylvania, we have very, very close elections.
Yeah, I was looking a little bit earlier to see if I could use a Pennsylvania example of a landslide election, and it took a while to find one. I think the closest one I found was the 98 gubernatorial election, where Ridge won with about 57%, and the next highest vote getter only got 31%. So in an election like that in 1998, right, there's a landslide. So you only need to look at a small number of ballots to provide confirmation. Again, not of the specific margin, but just, did Ridge win? Yes or no, right? So you can look at a small number of ballots to do that, versus, again, when you have, like many other elections in Pennsylvania where you have very, very tight margins, you're going to want to look at a larger sample of ballots so that you can go back, right, and log those results, depending upon the flavor of RLA you do, right? Like, are you going to compare that to the machine totals? Are you going to compare it on the back end on a batch level? And so that's right, like it works inversely. The larger the margin, the smaller the sample. The smaller the margin, the larger the sample.
Got it. So the closer the election is, right, if that margin is very, very small, you're going to be hand counting more ballots to double check that result.
Absolutely. And again, in Georgia, the presidential election was very, very close. I don't remember the margin off the top of my head, but very, very close. And the risk limiting audit required basically that we hand count all of the ballots. So that's what we did across the state, or that's what Georgia election officials did. They hand counted all of the ballots that were cast.
Got it. So like sort of the most maximal RLA is just a full recount.
Yes, 100% confidence level.
Got it. So I'm just thinking through this process of how we got to where we are now. So Jeff does the first one. He's nervous. He does it. It's a success. He starts convincing other counties. Jonathan, in previous elections, we've heard about RLAs as still, even when done statewide, it was still like a pilot. It was done afterward. But you said a few minutes ago that now that's actually changing. So can you talk about what it was and what it is now?
Sure. So what it was, counties were still required to do their 2% statistical sample. And I want to stop just for a minute just to make sure we put a fine point on this. I mean, one of the biggest drawbacks or limitations of a fixed percentage audit is that it is not scalable to the facts of a given election. And Liz just did a great job explaining why that's true. That is the number one biggest advantage of risk limiting audit, is it actually can respond to the specific facts about an election. A fixed percentage, you're doing the same amount of ballots, no matter how close the margin is, no matter what the facts are about that specific election. But what we're doing, so counties were doing the 2% statistical sample over the past 2 years, we did a number of statewide risk limiting audit pilots, but those were done after counties certified their election results. What's going to be different starting with this November is that risk limiting audit will still be done in addition to the 2% statistical sample. That's still a requirement, but the risk limiting audit, as well as the 2% statistical sample, will be completed before the county certifies their results to the Department of State. So voters will be able to have confidence at the time that the results are certified that the outcome of the election is accurate.
Got it. So we went from testing in a couple of counties to testing it statewide. But even at that point, it was sort of after certification, it was like we're learning as sort of after we're done with the election. And now you're actually making it part of the election process.
Correct.
All right. That is going to take us into the next half of this, which is certification. But before we get there, I do want to just briefly touch on the rest of the sort of audit idea, because again, so many things have been called audits. And so, Jeff, why don't we start with you? What else are counties doing, right? Like after an election, you're not just like packing up and walking away. You are sort of checking other things. And so even if we don't call it an audit, what are the other things that you do outside of checking the results? What are you doing to ensure that, equipment worked properly and the election was run well?
There is post-election machine testing that's required to make sure that the machines, again, performed accurately. We had a spreadsheet, for example, we did reconciliation every election in our county. I had a spreadsheet with probably a dozen columns, and those were broken down by precinct. And we literally would go precinct by precinct, reconciling the ballots cast versus the number of voters who were given credit. We would make sure that the absentee ballots that were returned, again, were reflected accurately, that were counted, minus the ones that would have been set aside for maybe some defect, such as maybe a missing secrecy envelope or being returned too late. Our provisional ballots, there would be a category for our provisional ballots and ensure that those that were accepted or partially accepted were also included in the tally. So there was a whole list of items that counties are required to reconcile to ensure that everything is accurate beyond just tabulating the results.
Got it. So we have the audit of the results themselves. We've got equipment testing. We've got reconciliation of the votes and the poll books and the voter lists and all of that. Jonathan, is there anything else we're missing right now in terms of sort of the major ways that you check an election?
No, I think that covers the major things, but Jeff made a good point, and I want to, I get a lot of questions. The secretary gets a lot of questions about, why does it take Pennsylvania so long to count ballots? We've talked about pre-canvassing, but there's also a lot of this is by design. The certification, we're going to get into the certification process, but it is a process. There's a lot that goes on after election day. That reconciliation is one part of it. But counties are also, we prioritize here in Pennsylvania, making sure that we get the count accurate. Speed is great. I appreciate knowing sooner rather than later, but we want to make sure everyone's voice is heard. We can receive ballots up to a week after election day from military and overseas civilian voters. We have provisional ballots that have to be adjudicated, and each of those processes is tedious and because it has to be done a certain way. It's transparent. So it has to be done in a meeting where candidates and political parties can have representation there to observe the process. So that means it's going to take a long time. But at the end of the day, voters can have confidence that it's accurate. So all of these post-election processes are built to ensure that the outcome of the election is correct and that the results are accurate. That doesn't mean there aren't mistakes made. That doesn't mean that you don't find errors, but the great thing about our process here in Pennsylvania is that you usually find those errors earlier in the process before you certify election results. You don't find them after the fact.
All right, so let's talk about certification then, because I think that gets thrown around a lot. And when it comes to the results, we have so many stages of getting the results, right? We have election night, we have what we sometimes refer to like unofficial official results or unofficial final results. We saw that with the recount in the primary, right? We were like, these are the unofficial final results, but they're going to change. And then we're going to have a recount, and that's going to change them a little bit more. So, Jonathan, what is certification?
Well, I mean, certification in each individual county, and Jeff can certainly chime in. You know, he was an election director, but certification is the process of going through all of your, you know, officially canvassing all of your results. You know, we know what pre-canvassing is, we know what canvassing is of absentee and you know, mail-in ballots, but the process beginning on Friday after election, the county goes through all of that. All of the records that they're reconciling, they go through a process. Again, it's transparent. It's in an open meeting where candidates and political parties can have authorized representatives there to observe the process and to challenge decisions of the Board of Elections if they believe that something is incorrect or inaccurate. And they're going through basically on a precinct by precinct basis to make sure everything checks out. And if they find a discrepancy, the Board of Elections actually has the authority to call the precinct election officials in until they get to the bottom of that discrepancy and check it. So as I said, the whole process is designed to ensure that by the end of it, you have guaranteed that the result is accurate
And
or as close to guaranteed as you possibly can.
And I'll just add as you get to the final steps of that certification process, the counties are creating what we used to call the official book. And all of that work ultimately goes into a book that is kept forever by law. And all of the results that were recorded, everything, whether it was in-person voting, mail and absentee voting, provisional voting, all of those numbers, and then the totals are all in that book for each candidate. And we are required to advertise a public meeting of our Board of Elections where we take that book for the first time for what we would describe as the first signing. And so our Board of Elections, they double check all of our work and they look through and make sure they're not seeing anything that looks out of the ordinary and make sure all the numbers that they expect to see are there. And they simply, at the end, they sign an affidavit affirming that these results are accurate. And you talked about the unofficial and official. Even on our website, we were very clear in always keeping the remarks or the results identified as unofficial until another step. So even at this point, when there are no more votes coming in, the Board of Elections has signed the official book for the first time. They're still unofficial in our eyes. But that would start a 5-day window for objections or challenges to be filed to those results. So even at that point, there is a process in our election code that still allows candidates and even voters to potentially object to what they're seeing, whatever the reason might be. And they have a 5-day window where they can file those objections, I believe in the local common police court. And if there are no objections filed in that 5-day window, we take that book, the same official book, back to our Board of Elections. And again, another publicly advertised open meeting, and they would affix their signatures a second time. And then and only then is what we then determine the results are officially certified. And then we go to our website and we change the word unofficial to official.
Yeah, and then we pick it up there from there for federal and counties. Also, at the time they certify their results, they also have to send a copy of their certified results to the Secretary of the Commonwealth for her review. And we compile the results from the 67 county boards of elections, and then the Secretary will certify the official results for all federal offices, state level party offices, and even some county row offices that the governor issues commissions for. So that's kind of how the process works. And we're looking at that as well. You know, we're not simply, you know, passing on it. We're looking at it. We're making sure that what we see from the counties, because, you know, in spite of all their due diligence and all the work they do, You can still make an error transcribing a number into the department certification. So we take a look at it and we make sure that it looks good. And then ultimately the Secretary of the Commonwealth will certify to whatever authority she has to certify to. So in the case of representative in Congress, it's the clerk of the U.S. House of Representatives. U.S. Senate, it's the Secretary of the Senate.
And I know there's some automation behind it now that I never took advantage of, but just so folks understand some of that process, counties would be required, and this was talk about a tedious process, like for all of the offices that we were required to report to the state, it wasn't just reporting one number. So that would be easy if it was just giving the total. We would have to go through and report every precinct as a double check, essentially, to guarantee that those numbers are adding up. And boy, that would be fun sometimes if your numbers, your totals didn't add up. And they would usually be just a transcription error in one of the precincts, and you'd have to go back one at a time and figure it out. But you could imagine there were years where, you know, in a county like ours, which is small, maybe at the time with 100 precincts, we might have 20 candidates that we would have to report 100 different precinct numbers for, all, you know, one at a time, and then submit those to the state.
So if I'm thinking about the certification process as sort of finalizing the vote, you're double checking it and you're making it official, right? Like, if you know, to use the unofficial versus official, it's not like the unofficial results are fake or not real. Those are real results, but things can go wrong, and sometimes they do. Sometimes somebody puts something wrong, and you know, we double check everything. Certification, it's a multi-step process. So Jeff, at the county level, you're double checking everything. You're opening a window for people to challenge it. All good. You sign off. You're sending it to the state. At the Department of State, you're double checking it. You're adding things up, because also we have races that cross county lines, whether it's statewide, some different legislative districts. You're adding up those results, double checking them. Then it's final. You're making it official. That's the official result. Is that right?
Yes. If that question's for me, then yes, the department, after compiling all of the certified results from the boards of elections, then yes, that when the secretary signs it, puts her seal on the document and submits it to the whatever authority should get it, that's effectively when it's official.
And this is a process that takes time. And the day I'm always looking for is 20 days, right? Like just under 3 weeks after election day. Right after election day, you know, sometimes on election night, we know who wins different races, sometimes in the days afterward, you know, but even let's say like 2020 election, everybody's waiting to find out who won. News organizations call it 4 days later, and everyone's like, that took forever, but it's actually not done. The vote count continues. You all use up that 20 days. Like, I watch counties use that full 20 days. So Jonathan, can you tell me a little bit about that? Like, it does take time.
Yeah, again, and we've talked about, you know, the things that happen after, you know, after election day. All of those take time, you know, adjudicating provisional ballots, you know, challenges that may come out of those. You know, you have to have county has to have a hearing. They have to notify the voter. The parties are given an opportunity to come in and make their case. Then, as Jeff noted, within that 20-day period, there's also that 5-day waiting period built in between the moment that the county actually finalizes the count and the moment that they can certify it. You know, and you could have recounts, and we've had them here in Pennsylvania. You mentioned we've had close elections. We've had 2 statewide recounts just in the last 2 years. Now, the one thing I will say, you know, and I think this is a testament to all the work that the counties do. We've had those 2 statewide recounts, and the margin hasn't changed. Each candidate may get a few more votes, but overall, the margin pretty much stays the way it is. And I think that, you know, should give voters a really high level of confidence that the initial count was accurate. And though the votes may change slightly, the margin of victory hasn't changed. And we've done these enough. So we've never seen a case where there was some wild swing in the vote totals, and certainly nothing that impacted the outcome of an election. But all of that takes time, and it's very tedious, and time consuming. It takes effort. These post-election audits, the 2% statistical sample, you're in counties the size of Jeffs County, Mercer County, you don't have a lot of full-time staff, so you're relying on effectively citizens or poll workers that you've deputized. They come in, they take the same oath of office, essentially, that poll workers take that serve on election day, and they serve as the canvassing board. Because the Board of Elections is made up of 3 people. In some counties, they only have a handful of staff in addition to themselves. So you also have to pull all of that together, and it's a logistical challenge. And fortunately, we've seen in most counties, we've seen a high level of participation from citizens, and that's the first thing I say when somebody says, "Well, I have doubts about the process." You know what? Volunteer. That's the best way to learn, because I guarantee you, your county board of elections is probably looking for additional canvassers to help do these post-election audits and do post-election canvassing.
So Liz, you told us that the RLAs are really the gold standard, and that with Pennsylvania making this part of the post-election process now, really making it part of the process, it's going to be before certification now, right? It's not just like a thing we're also testing. That puts us sort of toward the front of the pack. Are there a lot of other states that do it as part of like the certification process, like not just are trying it out or they do it to double check the results, but really are using it to verify the results before they make it official?
So Colorado, Georgia, Rhode Island do the risk limiting audit prior to certification. Virginia, when they originally passed the state law, required that the audit be done post certification, and explicitly in statute said that the outcome of the audit couldn't impact the outcome of the election. They have recently modified that, and I want to go back and check, but I believe that the amendment that they made and recently passed now requires the audit to be conducted prior to certification. I think what you saw in Pennsylvania about how this was adopted is absolutely a model for other states, right? So you work with your local election officials and with state election officials, you work with counties, you pilot them, you see what works in your state, right? And you can slowly move the procedure into your existing election calendar. And every state's election calendar is a little bit different. So that is, you saw a process in Pennsylvania, which I think is an excellent model for many of the other states that are considering this. In some states, they allow counties to pick on an individual basis whether they do a traditional audit or a risk limiting audit. So you'll see that in Oregon and in states like Ohio. But really, the way that Pennsylvania is doing this, right? Because we want to provide confirmation of the accuracy of statewide elections, right? And so you have to have all the counties participating in that. And so not only is the ultimate outcome, which here is a directive by the secretary that they're going to conduct risk limiting audits after primary and general elections, the right, we think the right outcome, but also the way that this decision was made, having outside organizations, having the counties and the election officials lead the determinations about the details of the procedure.
Got it. Jonathan, with the RLA this time occurring before certification, what should voters and the public, what will we see? Like, will we notice something occurring? Is there a thing that happens that we'd see?
It will depend on how close people are paying attention, but yes, it will be done during the official canvass. It'll be done transparently. I would expect that those counties that live stream all of their post-election canvassing activities, you may be able to check it out and see it for yourself. But it will be done transparently, so voters will notice. They're not necessarily going to see, we still have the statutory calendar where, you know, you have election night, unofficial election night returns, counties continue counting absentee and mail ballots, and then you have updated unofficial results. And then we have a statutory deadline the Tuesday after election where counties have to send the department updated unofficial results for statewide offices, identify any outstanding military and overseas civilian absentee ballots that are going to be counted on the following day. They get counted, they get canvassed on the 8th day following the election. So there's a lot of activity. So I don't know if people are going to notice the RLA specifically because it's occurring in the midst of all of these other activities. You know, the 2% statistical sample as well. But yes, if folks are paying attention, certainly if you're representing a candidate or you're representing a political party, you'll be able to be there and you'll be able to observe the process as it's going on. And then ultimately those results will be reported up to the Department of State. And then, you know, we would release you know, as we've done with our pilots, we would release a report that shows the results of the post-election risk limiting audit.
And that's important too, Jonathan, to emphasize. You know, we did the 2%, you know, my entire career, and the file would go into a drawer, or, you know, with the election file for that election, and not one voter or candidate or party would ever come in to ask to look at it. We didn't submit it. There was no requirement to submit those numbers or results to the state. They just, our Board of Elections would see it and they would go away. And you know, the environment has obviously changed, and not necessarily for the worse, that people are paying attention to that now, and it is critical. And I think it's a good step for the state to want to get those results from every county in order to be able to publicize them in order to hopefully help reassure voters.
Right. And in addition to the results of the risk limiting audit, you know, Act 88 passed earlier this year requires counties for the first time ever to submit to the Department of State the outcome of their 2% statistical sample as well. So the department will have information not only about the risk limiting audit, but also the outcome of the 2% statistical sample in each county. So we'll have a lot of good data available centrally here at the Department of State that voters can access and look at to see tangible evidence of this post-election ballot auditing process that's occurring in each of the 67 counties.
You mentioned statewide recounts, because as we've talked about, we do have very, very close elections. Can you just briefly, you know, as you said, we've had a recount in the last statewide election in May. We had a recount in the previous statewide election in November. So clearly this is a thing that occurs. Can you just briefly tell us, you know, what triggers that and what happens?
Sure. So, I mean, the trigger is pretty straightforward. If the election is decided by the margin is 0.5% or less of the votes cast, we see it most frequently in municipal elections, municipal primaries, where you may have 3 or 4 open seats on one of our statewide appellate courts. And you have, you know, multiple candidates, 9 or 10 candidates running for those 4 seats. Obviously, you're going to have, excuse me, the votes split up among more candidates. So you're more likely to have a narrower margin. So but that's the trigger. It's 0.5%. So earlier this year, I'm sure that's fresh on everyone's mind, we had a statewide recount in the Republican primary for the U.S. Senate race. That was well inside 0.5%. It was actually inside of 1,000 votes, just raw votes. But again, the outcome, it ended up after the recount, it was still about 1,000 votes. Everyone got some additional votes, but we were right about it exactly the same margin of victory. And that was an extremely close election.
And remind me, did we do an RLA that time?
We did not do an RLA because counties were focused on doing the statewide recount. but they did do their 2% statistical sample. And as I said, beginning this November, we're going to be doing the 2% statistical sample, the RLA. I am hopeful that we, I don't care who wins. I never talk about, my opinion about candidates. But, like most election officials, none of us hope that it's inside of 0.5%. As exciting as that is, we've done it enough recently. So I'm hopeful that we won't be dealing with that. But I'm confident that if we do have to deal with another statewide recount, that once again, our county election officials will show everyone here in Pennsylvania and everyone across the country that we run free, fair, and accurate elections here.
And I can vouch for that, Jonathan, to say that there have been some elections where the margins were like at 0.45%, and then it would go to 0.49, and nobody's cheering for the candidate. All we're cheering for is the margin. Get over that 0.5. You may hear a collective scream across Pennsylvania when it crosses that threshold.
It's fun for some of us. Yeah, gives some of us something to do. All right, so we've talked about audits, we've talked about certification. In the previous two conversations, we've talked about requesting ballots, returning them, getting them counted. So I just want to take a step back. We've talked about the critical processes and safeguards in the election system. We've talked about ways that we are changing those processes and improving them, like moving from 2% audits or 2,000 ballot audits to the RLAs, and the way that we've even improved the way we're doing the RLAs and made that formal as part of the process. There's still a lot of changes that can be made, right? No state is perfect, and Pennsylvania certainly has things that can be changed. So Jonathan, I'll kick it to you. So you have the easiest job because nobody's gone before you. What is a key change that you would make to improve Pennsylvania's electoral system?
Well, I'm gonna jump out in front of it, and we've said it before. I know I've testified about it. Counties have testified about it. Most states have a meaningful pre-canvassing period prior to election day to pre-canvass absentee and mail-in ballots. So that would absolutely be at the top of my list. I do think though that there's more we can do related to post-election auditing. We have a very cumbersome, I didn't mention it earlier, but one of the other things counties are doing during those 20 days is accumulating write-in votes. And Pennsylvania has a very, very charitable, I guess is the word I'll use, write-in requirement. Counties have to count up all of the write-in votes. Most states have some sort of pre-election process where where a candidate has to, announce that they're a write-in candidate, and you can kind of weed out the Mickey Mouses and the people who put the names of dead presidents in. Not here in Pennsylvania. Our law is it requires counties to go through all of those, and a lot of times they'll just report like a number of scattered write-in votes, which are all the single, but they still have to deal with them. So that's the other thing that I would change. I think there's some changes that would help counties in that post-election period, because again, it's about the will of the voters and making sure that the will of the voters have been served. And I think having to deal with all of the frivolous write-in votes is a burden on counties during that 20-day post-election period. Jeff? And I think Jeff agreed because I saw him shaking his head.
Look, my ideal legislation, Jonathan got the two big ones: pre-canvassing, requiring candidates to certify write-ins ahead of an election. Literally, it would just be an affidavit or an affirmation, nothing substantial. And I would pair that with removing the 2% statutory requirement and replacing it with the RLA. And I would also, talking about some of the post-election issues, I think statistically we've seen enough recounts in Pennsylvania to realize that the 0.5% threshold in this day and age with the accuracy of the equipment is way too large. The numbers just don't move enough to require an automatic recount statewide for that margin. I would also pair a reduction in that threshold with all of those updates as well, maybe 0.25 or something a little bit smaller. Even that's probably too large for what we've seen most of those races ever move. But look, if you put those four things into a bill, I think you would have elections officials celebrating across Pennsylvania.
Well, these gentlemen know much more about the details of Pennsylvania election administration than I do, but what I can say is that election officials in Pennsylvania and across the country are chronically underfunded and under-resourced. Our election officials got informed in 2017 that they were responsible for protecting our election infrastructure against well-funded foreign adversaries. Their responsibilities now also include combating the deluge of mis, dis, and malinformation being distributed by, again, well-funded entities about what they're doing and about our election system. They're subjected to not only additional scrutiny that you've heard referenced a couple of times tonight, but also death threats, etc. And they're, as was also mentioned, sometimes these offices have just one full-time person and the responsibilities, right, are just being added to them. So our federal, state, and local governments need to do a better job of appropriately funding our election officials.
I'm Jonathan, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to hijack this for a second and ask you as a voter, what would you like to see changed? I mean, at the end of the day, I think people sometimes lose sight of the fact this is about voters, and any change you make has an impact on real people. And so I'm curious, what would you change, Jonathan, knowing that you're a voter who has studied this subject extensively? So I'm curious what you would change if you were asked. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I had to.
That's good because we're all talking about administrative sides. It's actually fascinating to hear a voter perspective. Yeah.
I can't say too much because I'm also a journalist who covers this stuff, right? So I have to be careful advocating. I guess the only thing I would say is not actually a policy change. I think the one thing that has become very clear to me in several years of covering this area is not enough people listen to the county elections officials who actually run elections. And I think people don't necessarily understand that, this is all across the country, but especially in Pennsylvania, counties run elections. Jonathan Marks is one of the top elections officials in the state. He and the Department of State oversee elections, but the Jeff Greenbergs of the world are running the elections. They're running multiple elections at the same time. They're running vote by mail. They're running in-person elections. They're running lots of precincts. And I think often, whether we're talking about policy making or we're just talking about rhetoric and we're talking about people making claims about stuff or proposing legislation or whatever it is, I think county elections officials are often left out of that conversation. And I think just hearing more from the people who are actually tasked with running that system would potentially make a big difference in how things run.
And just to emphasize that, Jonathan, when I started in 2007, that was the mantra of elections officials across Pennsylvania. And my late friend Ed Allison and I always had this conversation, and he would always remind me that we would be satisfied if we just got to the table with lawmakers in Pennsylvania. It took us 10 years to get to the table. We didn't get to the table until 2017, where lawmakers finally started to have some recognition that maybe we should ask election officials about elections. And then we weren't satisfied with that. So I would always get frustrated because there wasn't enough movement. And Ed would say, well, Jeff, you always used to say all you wanted to do was get to the table. You should be happy with that. And we weren't. So I think you're 100% right. And hopefully our legislators, those are the ones that really need to listen. And hopefully, these conversations will continue. We have a lot of work to do in Pennsylvania next year to get some of these issues resolved. We have time. Hopefully we have the will that we can do it, but we need the lawmakers to partner with elections officials in order to get that done.
So we are out of time, but because we are just a few days out from Election Day and we want people to vote, whether by mail, whether in person, however it is, Jonathan, I want to give you one more chance to just get that message out there. What do the voters of Pennsylvania need to know?
Again, the voters need to know if they're voting, they should make a plan to vote. If you're not voting by absentee or mail-in ballot, make sure you know where your polling place is. You can go on our website, vote.pa.gov, and use our polling place locator to locate your polling place. Or you can call our hotline at 1-877-VOTES-PA. One of the folks on our staff will guide you in the right direction. Again, if you're voting by absentee and mail-in ballot and you haven't already returned your ballot, we're recommending that you return it in person at this point and check it to make sure that you inserted it inside the secrecy envelope, sealed that in the outer declaration envelope. You signed the declaration envelope, you dated the declaration envelope with today's date, with current date. And again, make sure you get it back before 8 p.m. on election day.
All right. Thank you everybody for joining us for this conversation and the past two. Hope it was helpful. And, again, there's going to be a lot of information out there. Some of it's going to be mis and disinformation. Some of it will be wrong. Please pay attention to your trusted sources. Verify what you see, verify what you hear, especially before you share it. When in doubt, ask your county elections office, ask your local reporters, ask the Department of State, ask your trusted sources of information like the groups that sponsored this conversation. Thank you for joining us.